Well, Stuart, how are we doing this afternoon?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for taking the time today to come on the show. I really appreciate it. Do you mind giving us kind of a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Sure. I mean, I guess my bio, as you noted in our correspondence previously, is a little bit all over the place. So I'll just make it as brief as I can. So I started out with a music degree where I majored in classical guitar performance. Then, like a lot of liberal arts majors who aren't sure what to do with their lives, I ended up going to law school, practiced law for a few years, and decided I didn't want to bill hours for the rest of my life. So switched yet again, did a PhD in education policy, and was thinking about going into academia. And then a really cool opportunity opened up to work for what was then called the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, which was just starting up in Houston. So I moved to Houston and took a VP of research job that I worked at for about 9 years. And in that job, did a ton of work on evidence-based policy and sponsoring academic research and on trying to improve the scientific process, improve reproducibility. So that's became a key theme for the work that I like to do. So left Arnold Ventures, as it's now called, last year, and then worked with Patrick Collison to set up a small nonprofit think tank, I guess you could call it, that we're calling the Good Science Project, with the goal of trying to improve the funding and practice of science. So that's about as brief as I can make it.
I love it. No, that's super concise. That was perfectly delivered, Stuart. I'm curious, how did you first get interested in these problems of science? Like what's going on with science? Was it in the PhD program? Was it at Arnold Ventures when did you stumble upon it? Was it just a gradual thing where you just can't really quite remember?
I can remember an exact conversation where this really hit the radar screen. So I was sitting with John Arnold in mid-2012, had just started working there, and we had a conversation about evidence-based policy. And then we had both independently in the news seen a controversy over a Yale psychology professor whose name is John Bargh, which is spelled Vargh, but it's pronounced Bargh. He had done some studies that had failed to replicate, and it had become a controversy because he wrote a couple of, I think it was two, kind of angry columns on this website. I think it was psychologytoday.com. Where he accused the people replicating his studies of basically not knowing what they were doing and being incompetent. I think he's used words like empty-headed, something like that. And so it became this controversy in the psychology community, like, what's the value of replication? Does this work stand up? Is John Bargh being, over-the-top rude? And anyway, John Arnold and I had both seen this and thought, well, this is interesting. Like, what, is there anything more to this? So I started digging around, and it turned out that there were people in multiple fields, from medicine to economics to psychology, who had been talking about this problem of replicability and, whether we're really doing sound science or whether we're being overly influenced by the publication process and the need to just crank out positive findings at all costs and so forth. And so that became an important issue because, the Arnolds were trying to set up a foundation that revolves around evidence-based policy in a number of areas, from criminal justice to education, health, et cetera. But if your focus is evidence-based policy and you can't really trust the evidence, that's a big problem.
You got a problem.
So then it became a mission to try to figure out, well, how do we know what evidence we can trust, and how can we help to try to improve the evidentiary process and the process of research and science?
Gotcha.
Yeah,
so
it was that conversation on that day.
That was a conversation that kind of drove it. I'm curious. So you're trying to in that kind of interventions, based on solid research and findings, at Arnold Ventures at the time. I'm curious. I have the sneaking suspicion, or at least I did. I haven't followed the replication crisis super closely, so I'm not as well versed in it. But I had the sneaking suspicion that, we called it in maybe social psychology first because it's kind of, it's super legible. Like anybody can kind of read kind of a social psychology study and probably kind of understand what's going on. Whereas if it's like analytical chemistry, I don't know. If you don't have expertise in the field, it's harder to kind of get there. I guess my question is are some fields worse than others? And is it like a wide range, or are they all kind of bad, or some of them good, some of them not as bad? And what's your sense of that?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, of course, there are many, many different scientific and academic fields, so I can't claim to know all of them equally well. I do think social psychology in particular, is one area that was both problematic, as you're pointing out, but also easier to replicate. And so that matters. So the study I was talking about with John Barge, you may have heard of it, or some folks may have heard of it, but I'll just repeat quickly what that study was about, for purposes of the conversation. So he basically, it was a kind of priming study where he was priming students to have this like concept in their head without really telling them what he was doing. So he brought students into the lab, and he would have them on some pretext read over lists of words and try to remember them or something like that. And for some of the students that were being experimentally evaluated, some of the words on the list would somehow relate to old age, okay? And so the idea was this gets them kind of unconsciously or subconsciously thinking about being old. And so then what the real point of the experiment was, he had somebody timing the speed at which they walked down the hall as they left the room, right, where they read this list of words. And the students who had read the words that in some way related to being old ended up walking more slowly down the hall. So you're right. This is a very catchy finding. Anyone can kind of understand it, and it's also easy to replicate. I mean, because other people tried to do it and said, okay, this is something that you could do in an afternoon, right? So it's fairly straightforward. And then they found that it didn't really make a difference, which actually it shouldn't be all that surprising. I mean, imagine if we were that susceptible to everything that we came across. We read a word of old age, and then all of a sudden we're hunched over, decrepit, can't walk anymore, and then read about Michael Jordan and we're flying down the hall. Right? It'd be quite an odd world if we were that manipulable. But anyway, social psychology is for that reason, as you say, easier to understand a lot of the studies, and then easier, more straightforward to replicate them. And so it's therefore a lot easier to then kind of figure out what is the status of this field. Now, cancer biology, by contrast, is a field that also has some problems with replicability, but it's a lot harder to replicate studies. And I can point to a particular project that I funded while at Arnold, which is called the Reproducibility Project in Cancer Biology. And I might get a few little details wrong, but basically I think the original project was supposed to cost around $1.5 million, and it was going to try to replicate 50 cancer biology experiments over a period of 4 or 5 years, and that was going to be the project. Well, we ended up having to kick in some more money. I think it was around $500,000-$600,000. They ended up cutting back the number of experiments they were replicating to around, I forget what the final number was, maybe about 20. And the project took 8 years, and so the final results were just published earlier this year. So you might think, well, that looks like it was just inefficient in every possible way. It cost more, took longer, and did less. But the whole problem there is that it's virtually impossible to even to start replicating these cancer biology experiments, because what they found in every single case was they would read the article and they would say, there's a lot of missing steps, a lot of missing information. We can't tell what they did at this point. They had to have made a particular choice. So anyway, they have to go back to the original labs. And oftentimes the original labs weren't particularly happy or cooperative about working with them and saying what they actually did in the experiment. But when they would finally get the information about how did you actually do this experiment and what kind of materials and antibodies or et cetera, what did you use? The answer invariably was always well, here's a list of stuff you have to buy that's it's twice as long and costs twice as much as you thought. So anyway, this whole process just took an extraordinary amount of time and money and effort, and in some cases they just couldn't even get off the ground to replicate experiments. So I guess the point is that whole experience showed that it's just really hard to even try to replicate stuff. So it makes you wonder, okay, what is going on in that field? Because barely anyone can even try to replicate it unless they have a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of patience. So yeah, it's not necessarily a good sign. I do think there are other areas, physics and cosmology, at least from what little I know of it, that have more of a strong culture of replication. If someone says they found evidence of some cosmic wave or something, other physicists will be trying to independently analyze the data. And so I feel there's more of a culture of that sort of activity. But yeah, it's widely variable, I guess, across different fields. But there probably are a lot of fields that are problematic, and probably some that aren't really even aware of it or addressing the issue yet.
Gotcha. So it does make sense. There's some areas where it is easier just to replicate generally, just because of like certain, like you don't have to run these massive experiments that require all these compounds and et cetera. So it's kind of variable. That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, Stuart. If you had to grade humanities science today, how would you grade it? Are we doing okay? Are we doing really well, really badly, like somewhere in the middle? And it just like kind of, it depends like way too much, and it's very difficult to tell. What do you think?
I mean, it depends a lot on the context and the specific field you're talking about. Overall, I mean, let's give it a B minus. I mean, there are lots of areas of science and technology that are coming up with amazing discoveries and advances. But I still think there are lots of ways that we could do better. Our scientific system, particularly in biomedicine, it's more and more difficult for younger people to get a foothold within the system. And even when they get a foothold, they're tied down. They end up spending half their time probably on bureaucracy and writing more proposals. Endless numbers of proposals, because oftentimes, like, the funding rate at someplace like the National Cancer Institute might be around 9 or 10%. So 90+% of the proposals are not getting funded. So that's a lot of work to comply with all the requirements of the information that you have to provide, and then you don't get it funded. So I think there's a lot of ways that we're basically tying scientists' hands, and we could probably do a lot better.
Got it. How bad is it? And can you talk about this a little bit? This fact that the average age of NIH grant winners has gone up so much over time since like the 1980s or so.
Right. Yeah. I think it is definitely a problem. And NIH is aware of it, and they keep trying to expand like kind of early career grants, but it still seems like kind of a drop in the bucket compared to what they could be doing. Now, I do think that the aging of the population, with the baby boomers getting older, might be part of a function of this. So I was just looking the other day at the top grossing musical tours over the past 40 years. And around 1980, 81, the top grossing music tour was the Rolling Stones. Okay, so then you look at the top grossing musical tour last year, also the Rolling Stones. So, the Rolling Stones are just perennially popular, and, they tour a lot, evidently. So there's a case where, like, the exact same people are, getting older, but also making a lot of money in the process. So I think probably there's some of that that's happened within the NIH ecosystem as well, that there were people, baby boomers, who were like around 30-ish in 1980, and they became successful, and they built a reputation and a career. And now, because of, you can't mandate that people retire at 65, like now they're 70 and they're still cranking away at their lab. And so it's probably literally some of the same people, so it's not so much necessarily that NIH is biased towards elderly people now, as opposed to 30-year-olds in 1980s. It's probably they're funding some of the same people. There's a lot of kind of path dependence in who they fund. Success breeds more success. So you get an NIH grant at age 30 in 1980, and you just you're kind of set. That's what I suspect is part of what's going on. But all of that said, I mean, I do wonder if there are ways to kind of gently encourage people to retire and to make room for younger people, because there's this famous saying that science advances one funeral at a time. And there's people who have looked into this, and they found evidence that, like, when a very prominent scientist in a field dies, that there's kind of, explosion would be too strong, but there are more ideas that crop up in that person's particular field afterwards. So yeah, but I do think it's important, because a lot of throughout history, a lot of like young people by today's standards have done great things. Einstein's best year, arguably, was when he was 26. He published like Relativity and other papers in 1905. Heisenberg's Uncertainty Principle, he published that when he was 26. Paul Samuelson, who's the great economist, he wrote this book called The Foundations of Economic Analysis, which is like a classic economics book. It was based on his dissertation that he did when he was 26. I was just looking, Isaac Newton. I was wondering, when did Isaac Newton discover calculus? It was in his early to mid 20s. So it's certainly possible for people who are under the age of 40, under the age of 35, to do great work. And yet we're telling them with the NIH system, if you're 24 and you have a brilliant idea and you have a lot of talent, you can slave away, getting a PhD for the next however many years, 6 to 8 years possibly. Do one or more postdocs for possibly several years. And maybe by the time you're in your late 30s, you're kind of ready to start your career. And then, some talented people are going to say, wait a minute, I could go to any number of other industries and make a lot more money a lot more quickly and, not face this monumental hurdle of trying to navigate this, academic ecosystem. So yeah, that's one way in which I feel like, we could do things better. We could make more space for younger, brilliant people to follow their nose where it leads.
That's good. How much do you think, how much of the effect of having younger scientists is the fact that they're younger, they have more maybe it's fluid intelligence or something going on versus they just aren't encumbered with some of the, I don't know, previously held beliefs when they come to it. And it's probably not even important, distinguishing that. I don't know, but do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, that could be a good point. I mean, I do think that a lot of great scientific breakthroughs traditionally have come almost by definition from someone who has an idea that's different or makes a leap forward from what the mainstream in their field is doing. And I say by definition because I mean, if what you're doing in science is the same thing that everyone else is doing, that's not a breakthrough, right? A breakthrough, almost by definition, means you're doing something that's different, that brings in insights from another field. Maybe you've developed a new technology like X-ray crystallography, led people to be able to discover the structure of DNA. All these sorts of ways in which new ideas and new insights can be brought into a field, but almost by definition, it's something different. So maybe there's something to the idea that if you're someone who, for whatever reason, including being young, is less, tied down, encumbered by just the traditional view of the field. Maybe you haven't already spent 30 or 40 years building up a reputation for a particular finding of yours or a particular theory, right? Then maybe you have a better chance of making an advance. Let's take the Alzheimer's disease question. So. For many years, the focus there has been on the so-called amyloid hypothesis that that amyloid is this fibrous material that builds up in the brain and then makes people's brains slow down, and ultimately die. And if only we could prevent or somehow remove or cure this amyloid problem, then that would cure Alzheimer's. And there have been dozens and dozens of clinical trials of drugs that are apparently in some way successful at addressing amyloid, but that don't actually they end up not resulting in clinical improvements, like people's ability to think or their lifespan. So I would argue that, if you want new ideas in the Alzheimer's field, it's probably not going to come from some of the famous scientists who have literally spent the past 30 years saying amyloid is the answer. We know it. It's going to work this time. They just have it's hard for someone who's 60, 70 years old and who has made their entire career publishing on one particular hypothesis to suddenly say, all right, I guess I was wrong. I'm ready to try something new. I mean, people always find ways to dig in. I mean, I guess it's part of our kind of set of cognitive biases that people find ways to discount new evidence and to say, well, no, I really was right all along. We just haven't tested it in the right way yet. I mean, that's always kind of part of it. So that argues that, finding ways to steer more money to younger people who are, less weighed down by the kind of reputational effects they would feel from trying a new idea, that's probably a good idea.
It definitely sounds helpful. I'm curious what your take is on. It seems like the flip side of this coin could be, I could come back and say, well, Stuart, maybe it's something like it's gotten so difficult to get to the frontier. It takes you until you're 40 to actually get to the frontier of some of these fields. You mentioned something in the outline which reminded me of this thought I had in in high school, it's like, man, they're teaching us calculus, but 400 years ago, we hadn't even come up with calculus yet. You know what I mean? And so the frontier like keeps getting, and are there limits to this? Oh, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, there may be something to that as well. I mean, that's, this issue is really complicated when you get down to it. So, I think the analogy I mentioned to you earlier, or the example I mentioned to you earlier, was that, in the early 50s, early 40s, you could get somewhere in biology by saying, I'm going to figure out the structure of DNA. And so when Crick and Watson, and also the Rosalind Franklin, who they didn't credit, published the structure of DNA, and I think it was 1953, that's a huge advance, right? Today, that you can't get anywhere by saying I'm going to figure out the structure of DNA. It's old news, right? You learned it in 10th grade biology, right? That's the great scientific advance of 70 years ago becomes just kind of a standard textbook material in high school today. You're exactly right. So today, if you want to make advances in molecular biology, you've got an additional 70 years of material to learn, and so that you can figure out where to advance the frontier in that field compared to where someone was 70 years ago. So maybe in any given scientific field, it just builds up and builds up over time. And so maybe it's possible that that people come along later just find it harder to, or it takes longer to master all the material that they would need to know in order to figure out what could be next. But at the same time, there are lots of new academic fields or new advances that come up. So 100 years ago, there was really no such thing as genetics or neuroscience or information theory or AI research or, any number of fields that we now have. So maybe, there will be new scientific fields, 50 years from now that someone who's young and brilliant, might be able to come up with the germination of a new idea that sets off in a new direction. So I think maybe we need to think about making sure there's spaces and funding for people to kind of explore new directions or come up with new ideas for combining new scientific and forming new scientific fields.
Got it. I'm curious. This question's related to something you said just a little bit earlier in that piece. It's is part of what's gone on the fact that we've kind of weeded out the weirdos to some extent, and that the people that now can win grants, they're good at sales, and they have to be decent at science too. But really, what you're selecting for in this kind of evolutionary process is can you go out and win grants, not can you have these like really weird and interesting ideas.
Yeah, it could be an issue. There are, I guess, some people who would argue that, for all the successes that we've had with NIH and NSF and other, forms of scientific funding, that maybe we need more space in the world for just like completely different alternatives. That everything now has become so standardized and bureaucratized and kind of reduced to what like bureaucrats can process on, and so it's become more difficult to really come up with something that's brand new because that doesn't fit within the confines of what NIH and NSF are already doing, or what they view as the source of science that we fund at this place. So. I do think there could be something to that, and that's where I hope that with the recent kind of explosion in philanthropic advances in science, there have been all sorts of kind of new scientific efforts that have cropped up in the past few years. Someone called it a Cambrian explosion in a way. I hope that they do that they do this very deliberately. That they don't end up just falling into the trap of doing things in one particular way and saying this is the way. I hope that throughout that new ecosystem of philanthropically supported scientific institutions, that there's much more kind of capacity for experimentation and just trying out new approaches, new ideas, new ways of funding people, and that's I think a very hopeful sign. And maybe optimistically, fingers crossed, that could even lead to new political developments that would result in NIH and NSF taking new approaches. So
that's good. That's really good. This reminds me of a previous guest we had on, Don Braven. Do you know Don by any chance?
Not personally. I know who you're talking about, and I've read his book. So
gotcha. Yeah, so he had this idea, just for the audience, that, what we should be doing is go out. You kind of like have this venture investor. Maybe, Stuart, you'd be this like science venture investor. You go and interview interesting people, and you just kind of give them funding. Yeah, and you ask them, do you have an attack on a problem? They're like, yes, we want to go explore this. And you just kind of let them go out and do it. And this was his approach. He claims to be quite successful at it. What do you think about that kind of approach of just giving people money instead of having them like apply for grants? Like, just try and have a venture approach to science where perhaps for basic research, we just go find talented people, give them money to go pursue their interest, and see what comes out the other side. Should some more of our science funding look like that, or at least some percentage? Yeah,
I think definitely a larger percentage should look something like that. It probably wouldn't work for a majority or let alone all of science, because I don't know. Then you get into the problem of like, how do you know who to trust? Is it just going to be some people funding their own friends? And how do you do this at scale? NIH has something like 90,000 grants at any given point in time. Like, and they've peer reviewed much more than that. So how do you do something like that at that kind of scale? But yeah, I think there's definitely a place for that kind of approach. I mean, a lot of top scientists will say in surveys that their approach to their own research or their own research agenda would be different if they had funding like what you're talking about. And in fact, there's a Nobel Prize winner that I interviewed on my website, and he said that he thought he would be doing more creative and interesting work if he didn't have to worry about pleasing funders. So, I mean, if that's what someone who's a tenured Stanford professor who has won a Nobel Prize says about his work, that he feels too tied down by the need to please funders, I mean, imagine how it affects like someone who's 27 and has a brilliant idea, but doesn't have the Nobel Prize to fall back on, or the tenured Stanford position. So yeah, I think that should be a much bigger part of our scientific ecosystem.
Got it. Yeah. Going off of that, what do you think like a really robust science funding ecosystem looks like, perhaps for the United States? If you had to go find like a leverage point to fix things, have you like gotten far enough along to kind of draw some big conclusions there, or like policy prescription?
Well, I mean, so one policy prescription would, or just approach would be that like there's no one right way to fund science. Like that, in fact, thinking that there's one right way is part of the problem. Then we end up forcing everybody into the same box, right? So I guess the main message I would have is that there's no one right way to do things, and therefore we should have a broad, diverse portfolio, just as you would if you were like investing like billions of dollars for like a pension system. You would hopefully diversify, not invest everything in crypto or everything in treasury bonds. Like you need a wide range of possible approaches, because that alone was going to help you kind of maximize your returns, because you have some safe investments, you have some more risky investments that might fail but that might pay off extraordinarily. I think we should be taking the same kind of portfolio approach across science, and we should be learning from what we do in science and learn in science funding. We should be more deliberately experimenting, trying new things, and trying as best as we can to measure the impact of doing things in different ways. And so one policy prescription I would have, though, in order to kind of institutionalize this approach to innovation is modeling on something called the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. And so that's, I don't know if you call it an agency, but it's like a unit or a team or whatever within Medicare and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And it was set up by the Affordable Care Act with funding at $1 billion a year. And the whole point of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation is to try new ideas that might cut costs for Medicare and Medicaid without harming quality, or that might improve quality without raising costs, so that you can bring costs and quality into more alignment. Because one of the big problems in medical spending is that we pay through the nose and then we don't get that great of results. That could be like population wide. Like we're not doing so great in terms of lifespan or health outcomes. So the big question in healthcare, like how can we stop spending so much and how can we get better outcomes? So you have this massive government bureaucracy that spends, upwards of $1 trillion a year. How do you get it to improve? Well, one way was to set up this center for innovation, where the whole point is that now you have people whose job it is to think of new ideas and to test out different ways of, let's say, paying doctors, paying nursing homes, paying hospitals, or measuring their quality, and then trying to measure and see the effects and see what works. And if something does work, then try to get the rest of the agency, or Medicare and Medicaid, to adopt it. And I think that's a brilliant idea to have within government agencies, is an innovation team that can really specialize in thinking of new ideas. And so I would argue that NIH and NSF and others should have an innovation team, again, that's solely focused on, like, how can we experiment? How can we try new ideas? How can we diversify what we're doing? How can we measure what works? And focus on what works and stop doing things that are overly bureaucratic and giving us bad results. So yeah, that I guess would be the policy prescription. It's not any one particular method of doing science, but institutionalizing innovation. I think that would be a really key move forward.
I really like that, and I've had this suspicion, this idea of, like, I really like the idea of, like, having innovation teams within these large bureaucracies that have, like, license to try more and different things. But I do wonder, is there something about the political economy of these bureaucracies where, okay, we set up an innovation team, perhaps you and I are on it, we come up with some weird idea, we come up with 100 ideas, but one of them's like, it's really weird, but we try it anyway. And the New York Times gets a hold of it, or some journalist gets a hold of it, and they're like, hey, this is all this agency's been doing, this is all anyone sees in the press, it goes viral, and then suddenly we clamp down on the innovation team because it's like, God, you're making Medicare look bad. Is that like an endemic problem, or am I just kind of overthinking that process?
Well, I mean, I think that could be a problem, but I think it's an even worse problem with the existing agencies right now. So if you go to the NIH director or NSF director right now and say, hey, I've got like 50 new ideas for ways you could do things, they would tell you basically, look, I'm already overworked as it is. No one in Congress is asking me to do this. If I did try your ideas, like the best case scenario is that no one pays attention, but probably someone's going to complain, and then I get called in front of Congress and I'm asked, like, why are you doing this? This wasn't even your job. So that's why innovation sometimes doesn't get very far in government bureaucracy. So, but then that's why I think if you have a group of people who have been specifically authorized and given the mission, try crazy things and see if it works. And I mean, now you have an audience for people that are willing to like try crazy things, and now they have like a statutory mandate, and they have hopefully some money to do it, and so that makes it easier for them. I mean, it could still get criticized, but at least they have the authorization and the expectation that that's the sort of thing they're supposed to be doing. So hopefully that would raise the chances of working out.
Definitely, I love that. And how do you think about trying to implement like policy ideas like that? Is it like, kind of like Alex Stapp's and Caleb's, Institute for Progress model, where you try to use the secret Congress or something? You go to D.C. and like lobby the agencies. Is it like, calling your congressperson? Like where are the good leverage points here? And you might not be comfortable talking about them, and that's fine. But I'm just curious in general, like how you think about that. Right.
Well, I mean, it's probably a long, slow road no matter what. I mean, so recently there was a health version of ARPA that got launched. ARPA-H is what it's called. And that's exciting new innovation within health funding. But it took several years. I mean, people were talking about that idea at least since 2017. Actually, since then, there's a guy named Robert Cook Deegan who's at Arizona State, I found out, he told me that he wrote an article arguing that there should be a health version of DARPA. He wrote this in 1997, but no one really paid attention to it, and so the idea languished out there. And then other people independently came up with the idea in around 2016, 2017. So yeah, they started arguing for it and writing articles about it, and at some point it has to cross over into like interaction with the folks at the White House who got behind it and so forth, and then ultimately into legislation and appropriations. So it took several years, and if you want to go back to 1997, it took 25 years for that idea to become reality. So I mean, I think it's a long, slow process to get this kind of innovation, but I also think it's super important because, the NIH alone is spending over $40 billion every single year, right? So, it's kind of like the saying that, what's the best time to plant a tree, 100 years ago or today, right? Sure, it'd be nice if you planted a tree 100 years ago and it was like a thriving, huge tree that provides shade and so forth. But if you haven't planted it, then you might as well start now, right? So the working on policy change for these big institutions, probably does take some time, but all the more reason to get started. And hopefully 5 or 10 years from now, there will be, a sets of policy proposals. There will be politicians, maybe presidents and White Houses that are interested in taking them up. I mean, it's very hard to predict, and you have to be opportunistic when the chance arises. But all the more reason to start arguing for these things and making the case and putting the proposals out there today.
And do you see that kind of as your main role? Is putting these ideas out into the ether, having policy proposals ready to go, and all these things so that they are set up so when the chance arises, you can help encourage good policy to be written.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's one of the main purposes of a good science project. Yeah, totally agree.
That's good. There's a risk in asking this type of question because you've got to work for these people. But how competent do you see as the federal government, like the funding bureaucracy? Are they really competent people just stuck in bad incentive systems? Are they not competent people set in good incentive systems? Like some mix of the two.
Probably some mix of the two. I mean, so a lot of the scientific agencies like NIH and CDC and FDA have come under a lot of criticism lately for being slow in responding to COVID and for any number of reasons, right? But even though there's a lot of validity to those criticisms, and even though there's lots of ways you can point to things that can be improved, I mean, on an individual basis, like if you talk to people who work at those agencies, I mean, you get the feeling that these are smart, competent people who are trying to do the best they know how to do within a system that most of which is beyond their control. So I think that's probably true for the vast majority of public servants, people that work at federal agencies. They're showing up to work, they're doing what they can do. They oftentimes might sympathize with trying new ways of doing things, but they don't have the time, they don't have the mission or the mandate to do that. So they themselves might end up being a little frustrated by their inability to change the overall system. And so I think that's in a way, hopefully one way that outsiders, like think tanks or advocacy groups, hopefully one way they can be helpful is to, in some ways, provide a little pressure, a little outside pressure that people who are sympathetic within the agencies will say, all right, now I can point to that. There are outside groups saying that we should do X, Y, or Z. So maybe we should try things that way, right? So that's another way that kind of policy change can happen.
That's good. That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. We talked a lot about government funding science. I want to talk about, corporations funding science. We used to have these great kind of big, innovation labs, Bell Labs. I think about all these, Xerox PARC. A lot of these innovations came out of these kind of basic research labs at large corporations. And we do have FANG companies have a lot of research labs, a lot of AI labs in particular, which do seem to be creating innovations, but it doesn't seem to be at the same scale, at least to me. Is it your sense that corporate innovation labs don't work as well now? Do they work as well, but they're just not as publicized? What do you think is going on there?
That's a really good question. I mean, I do think that, like Bell Labs, I think they benefited in one way from having this, from basically being associated with AT&T that had this nationwide telephone monopoly. So they're making all this money because they're a nationwide monopoly. And so they don't have to worry about, at that point, they hadn't been broken up because it wasn't the 80s yet, but so they don't have to worry about money. They've got more money than they know what to do with. They don't have to worry about selling a product this year or the next year. So they had the freedom, and they also, I think probably at the time AT&T felt maybe some political pressure to like show that we're doing something good. You know, we're not just a nationwide monopolist that's taking advantage of people, but look at what we're doing with our science, right? So there could have been part of that as well. And so anyway, you had a group of people at Bell Labs who were working on problems that in some way touched upon like telephone communications. So that touched upon like transistors or information theory and so forth and so on, but had the flexibility and the freedom to do what they wanted without the pressure to publish or without the pressure to produce something that is a marketable product. Like now, like they had the more intellectual freedom than that. So, and they might have benefited as well, possibly from some of these discoveries perhaps being a little more low-hanging fruit compared to, today. Like, inventing the transistor in the first place was a great innovation. At a certain point, like, we're trying to cram more and more transistors into smaller and smaller spaces. So at some point you hit a kind of limit as to what anybody can do there, and maybe it becomes harder to truly innovate. So maybe, you have to come up with new questions, new ideas, new fields of innovation and so forth. But yeah, the results, it's hard to say. I mean, so like Google has, it used to be called Google X, but since they switched their corporate name to Alphabet, now it's just called X. And they have a big campus where they do all kinds of projects. But I don't know. I guess I'm just not really sure what they've been doing or why. Or what the outputs have been. And maybe they're doing great stuff and they're just, I'm just not aware of it. So yeah, I'm not really sure what else to say.
Yeah, it may be unclear as well. That makes a lot of sense. Well, Stuart, are you down for a round of overrated or underrated?
Sure. Yeah. Can't guarantee I have any great answers, but yeah.
Well, Stuart, I'll throw out a term. You tell me whether it's overrated, underrated, properly rated, right, and perhaps why. So the first one is flamenco, and I may have butchered that pronunciation. Guitars.
Flamenco guitars, and that's interesting. I mean, I feel like probably for a lot of people they aren't rated at all. Like probably a lot of people don't even think about it very much. But probably amongst classical guitarists, they might, in some ways, like look down on flamenco as like a little too like kind of flashy and not as like pristine as in musical terms or whatever. So maybe underrated from that perspective. Yeah.
That's good. And, so you were trained as a classical guitarist, correct?
Yes.
Does any of that work, carry through today at all in what you do?
In what I do? I mean, not in any direct sense. I mean, I recorded this classical guitar album about 12 years ago, and it still makes money on Spotify somehow.
That's awesome.
Like, Spotify will send me like a direct deposit of sometimes $100, $150 in a month, and I just looked and to my complete astonishment realized that the top track on that album has been streamed over 7 million times on Spotify. Wow. So I'm completely amazed by that. But I guess that explains where the money's coming from. So I can't complain.
That's cool. Houston, Texas, overrated or underrated?
Probably underrated. I mean, there are lots of reasons to dislike Houston. I mean, it's flat. There's not a lot of like. It's not like a lot of gorgeous scenery. There's no redwood forests or mountains or anything like that. It's hot and humid. The whole place, the whole landscape, naturally wants to be a swamp, and so there's just swampy areas everywhere, and then lots and lots of drainage systems that are built to drain water out to the Gulf. I mean, it is one of those places where you think, my God, why did people ever decide to live here when they hadn't invented air conditioning yet? But I guess because of the availability of ports in the Gulf and so forth. But so yeah, I mean, there are ways in which it's underrated, but it's a bustling economy. It's extraordinarily diverse. I think one of the most diverse cities in the nation. So you have lots and lots of people from around the world that come to Houston because it's easy to to buy a home or to find a job. And so that makes it a kind of diverse and a place with a lot of vitality in that way. So yeah, there's a lot going. There are lots of ways to like kind of live a good life in Houston if you don't mind the heat.
It's a good deal. It's a good deal.
Yeah.
New Science, Alexi Guzzi's New Science, overrated or underrated?
That's interesting. So, maybe. I mean, can I say correctly rated? I mean,
sure,
I think
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very ambitious idea. I mean, I've heard Alexi say, his ambition is to, form a new NIH, which is, I mean, if you think about it, that's astonishingly ambitious because, NIH, as I said, 90,000 grants, 40+ billion a year. So, I mean, in that sense, that doesn't seem likely. I mean, but if you can direct enough philanthropic funding or perhaps, I don't know, perhaps over time funding from elsewhere, maybe funding from industry, I'm not sure, into giving scientists, training up scientists and giving them more freedom and flexibility, like some of the ideas we were talking about earlier, I think that has a lot of potential.
That's good. That's good. EA's funding academic research, is that underrated or overrated?
I think you must pick up on that because I wrote about that recently. So
That's right.
I think it's something that, to me, has been underrated or underprovided, and maybe that's the better way of putting it. But I feel like that a lot of effective altruists, particularly on the kind of global health and development side of things, have maybe arguably gotten a little bit stagnant in their approach to giving and I mean, it's like they've been talking about malaria and bed nets and deworming pills and, a few very discrete interventions that they value because there's been a lot of evidence that they work. But I feel like the scope and scale of all the problems that humanity deals with seems a lot broader than just like 3 or 4 interventions where you have the absolute best evidence. I feel like that there needs to be a bigger and broader push to come up with new ideas, new innovations, new interventions, new programs, new policies, and to develop more evidence and have a kind of R&D process that's laid out in a systematic, coherent agenda, and that directs a lot of money into finding the next list of interventions and ideas that would be tremendously valuable to the developing world.
That's great. That's great. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. Where can people find you? Where should we send them?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at, it's twitter.com at StuartBuck1, so the number 1. And then also goodscienceproject.org. So,
excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. We'll send people there. We'll put a link down in the show notes. Thanks so much, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.